Hi, I'm Evelyn Carter. Last Friday night, I walked into my husband's memorial dinner with a plate of apple pie and a hollow smile, and walked out with my name carved off half the ranch. My fork froze mid-air. My sister's hand dropped a fat envelope beside the roast, her voice slicing the air. My son is Daniel's blood. He left him half of everything. Not one person spoke up. Not one person stood for me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part, it wasn't just one night. It was years of sly visits, sidelong glances, and quiet scheming that all came crashing down at that table. So, what do you think happened after she set that envelope in front of me? Before we dive in, tell me, what time is it, where you are, and where are you listening from? Drop a comment below. I read everyone. The dining room smelled of roasted beef and overripe grief. Light from the last Montana sunset spilled across the pasture, catching the dust in the air like gold you couldn't hold. Clara didn't look at me again. She tucked the envelope closer to her plate, her boy fidgeting in her lap, blonde hair, same shade as Daniel's, catching in the light. The resemblance was deliberate, I thought. Howard, our lawyer, sat 2 seats down, adjusting his glasses. His eyes flicked from me to Clara, then back again. He knew. About the surgery. About the impossibility of her claim. But in that moment he stayed quiet, reading the air like it might explode. I took a sip of coffee gone cold. The bitterness bit my tongue. My hands stayed still on the tablecloth. If I moved, I might lunge across and rip that envelope in two. "You've done well here, Evelyn," Clara said, slicing her son's meat into neat cubes. "It must be exhausting, keeping this place going without help." The pity in her voice was the kind that rots. It wasn't sympathy. It was ownership in disguise. 17 years of mending fences, training horses, greeting guests. Our work, mine and Daniel's, reduced to one line in a forged will. My cheeks burned, but I kept my face neutral. The others at the table shifted uncomfortably. Plates scraped. Someone cleared their throat. No one defended me. It was the kind of silence that decides sides. I looked at Clara's boy. He grinned, showing a missing tooth, reaching for bread. He had no idea his mother had just turned him into a weapon. The gold outside was fading to blue. Shadows stretched across the pasture, swallowing the barn. The place Daniel and I built was slipping into night, just like my grip on this family. I pushed my plate away, my appetite gone. The envelope sat there, fat with lies, daring me to touch it. I didn't. Not yet. Because in that moment, I knew 2 things. 1, this fight would not happen in front of her audience. 2, when I moved, it would be final. So I sat back, folded my napkin, and smiled the kind of smile that means war without raising your voice. I didn't go back to my room that night. Instead, I walked past the barn, letting the cold April air bite at my cheeks. The horses shifted in their stalls, the sound of hooves against wood a slow, steady rhythm. That sound had been my anchor for 17 years. I thought back to the first spring Daniel and I spent here. The grass was thin and patchy, the fences sagging. We had 1 reliable mare, 2 temperamental geldings, and a stubborn dream. Daniel came home from his firehouse shift with hands that smelled of smoke and cedar. "We'll make it work," he'd said, leaning against the post with that grin, half challenge, half promise. I believed him. I always did. We built the guest cabins ourselves. Nights, we'd sit on the porch with mugs of black coffee, watching the sun drop behind the Bridger Mountains. My shoulders ached from hammering boards, but the ache felt like progress. Back then, Clara was just a voice on the phone, occasional check-ins, always polite, always brief. I remember the first time she visited. It was summer, high tourist season. I was in the Coral, teaching a couple from Denver how to saddle up. Clara walked in like she owned the place, city boots kicking up dust. Daniel's smile was polite, nothing more, but I noticed how long her hand lingered on his arm when she greeted him. She claimed she wanted to help out. Said she loved the idea of a working ranch. She'd take on odd chores, stacking hay bales, cleaning tack, but somehow always ended up in the house, in the kitchen with Daniel. I told myself not to read into it. Families were complicated. Over the years, she came and went, always with a story about a job gone wrong or a lease falling through. Daniel was kind. He'd offer her a room, a hot meal, sometimes a little cash. I didn't argue, but I started to feel the edges of our marriage fray. Still, there were good days. I remember a Thanksgiving when we had 12 guests in the lodge. Daniel carved the turkey while I poured wine, the whole room filled with the smell of sage and roasted squash. Clara sat across from me, smiling like she belonged there. I wanted to believe she did. Back then, I didn't know about the surgery yet. That news came later. An accident on a fire call, a rushed hospital stay, the doctor's gentle voice explaining what it meant for our future. Daniel took my hand and said, "It's you and me, Ev. Always." I held on to those words. Now, standing in the barn with the smell of hay and horses, I realized how far we'd come from that promise. And how fast it could all be stolen. It was the following winter, when Clara's visits started to stretch. She'd arrive with one small suitcase, claiming she just needed a few days to clear her head. Weeks later, she'd still be there, lounging at the kitchen table in Daniel's flannel shirts, sipping coffee like she belonged in his clothes. Daniel brushed it off. "She's family, Iv," he'd say, stacking firewood by the stove. "Eats what we do." I wanted to believe him, but the rhythm of our home was shifting. One snowy morning, I came in from feeding the horses to find Clara, perched on the counter, stirring sugar into his coffee. Daniel was laughing at something she'd said. The moment they saw me, silence dropped into the room like a stone. She was careful, always careful. A compliment here, a harmless joke there. Yet I caught her watching me sometimes, her eyes lingering a second too long, as if measuring what I might be willing to lose. By the time Daniel's accident happened, the truck skidding on black ice, the emergency surgery, Clara was a fixture. She stayed while I drove back and forth to the hospital, tended the ranch, paid the bills. On the surface, she was helping. Beneath, I felt her rooting herself deeper. The day the doctor told us about the injury, about the permanent change to our future, Clara wasn't there. It was just Daniel and me in that sterile room, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. He squeezed my hand and said, "It's still you and me. That's enough." I believed him. Months later, Clara returned, full of stories about a failed job in Spokane. She slid back into our daily life without asking. At first, I thought it was loneliness driving her. But as time passed, I began to see the patterns. Her questions about the ranch finances, her habit of showing up whenever Daniel was working alone. There was one evening in late summer, the light fading over the paddocks, when I caught her standing on the porch with him. They weren't touching, but their conversation stopped cold when I stepped outside. She smiled, too wide, and said, "Just talking about fence repairs." I didn't push. Not then. I told myself a family could weather small storms. But looking back, I see it for what it was. The first clouds of the one that would break everything. And by the time we sat at that memorial dinner last Friday, Clara wasn't just a guest in my home. She was a threat I'd ignored for far too long. We left the dining table, the clink of plates fading as the house settled into a quieter hum. The fire in the sitting room crackled, its light casting long shadows across the worn rug. I took a seat at the edge of the couch, the bitter taste of cold coffee still on my tongue. Clara chose the armchair nearest the fire. She draped her red coat over the back, leaning in like she'd been holding court here for years. Her boy sat on the floor by her feet, pushing a wooden truck along the edge of the hearth. "So," she began, voice warm enough to pass for kindness. "How's it going out there, Evelyn? Must be quite the challenge running the ranch alone." Her gaze lingered on me, just long enough for the words to turn sharp. A few cousins shifted in their seats. One gave a polite laugh that died too quickly. My aunt kept her eyes on her knitting, looping yarn without looking up. "It's going fine," I said. My voice felt steadier than my pulse. "I manage." Manage. Clara rolled the word like a piece of hard candy in her mouth. Well, Daniel always did have a knack for the hard work. Heavy lifting, big decisions, you know how it was. The fire popped, sending a burst of pine, scented smoke into the room. I caught Howard's eyes across the coffee table. Just for a second. Before he looked away, adjusting his glasses like they'd suddenly stopped working. We built it together, I said, each word clipped. Every fence, every cabin. Clara smiled, slow and deliberate. Of course. But it's a lot for one person. Maybe too much. She smoothed the boy's hair, her hand lingering like she was petting a prize colt. The room felt smaller. The heat from the fire pressed against my skin, but my hands were cold. I could hear the wind pressing against the windows, a faint rattle under the silence that followed her words. No one spoke. Not my cousins, not my aunt, not even Howard. The quiet stretched, heavy enough to bend the air. I swallowed hard, the taste of ash and coffee thick in my throat. Maybe, she went on, tilting her head as if weighing the thought, someone else should help make decisions. For the good of the property. I kept my face still. The only movement was my grip tightening on the mug in my hands, the ceramic warm against my fingers. Her words weren't just suggestion. They were a claim. One no one here seemed ready to challenge but me. Her sentence lingered in the air like wood smoke, sinking into the fabric of the room. I glanced at Howard again, hoping for a flicker of support, but his eyes stayed locked on the fire. The flames hissed and shifted, eating through another log. Of course, Clara said, leaning back in the armchair. It's not about taking anything from you. Just sharing the load. She let the words hang, then added, for everyone's benefit. Her tone carried that careful sweetness people use right before they close a trap. The boy ran his toy truck into the leg of the coffee table. The small thud broke the silence for half a second. Then it sealed back up, thicker than before. I set my mug down on the coaster. My fingers tingled from holding it too tightly. The ranch is fine, I said. I'm keeping it that way. Clara tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she'd already solved. I know you're trying, Iv. But things change. Circumstances change. She shifted her gaze to the others. Sometimes, you have to think about what's best for the long term. Not one person spoke. My aunt pulled her yarn tighter, the needles clicking faster. My cousin pretended to adjust the throw pillow beside him. The fire cracked, a sharp sound that made me flinch. It wasn't just silence, it was a choice. Every downcast gaze, every averted look told me exactly where I stood in this room. Alone. The wind pressed against the windows, rattling the glass in its frame. Outside, the pasture was swallowed in darkness. I thought of the fences Daniel and I had mended by lantern light, the nights we'd come in cold and laughing. All of that, and now this, reduced to a conversation no one wanted to defend me in. Clara stood, smoothing her skirt. She reached for her coat, shaking it out before sliding her arms through. Anyway, she said lightly, it's just something to consider. No rush. Her boy climbed into her arms, resting his head on her shoulder. She kissed his hair, then stepped closer to me. Her perfume, floral, sharp, cut through the scent of pine from the fire. Don't wear yourself out, Eve, she murmured, just for me. Some of us are more than willing to step in. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Then she turned and walked out, heels tapping against the hardwood in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Each step echoed down the hall, fading until the only sound left was the fire and my own breath. I stayed seated, staring into the flames until they blurred. Whatever battle she thought she'd started tonight, she'd see soon enough. I don't burn out. I burn through. 3 days later, the snow along the fence line had melted into muddy ribbons. I was in the barn, oiling a saddle, when I heard tires crunching on the gravel drive. Not the sound of Howard's truck. This was lower, slower. A silver sedan stopped by the porch. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his shoes sinking into the soft ground. He carried a leather briefcase, the kind that smells like old money and paperwork. Mrs. Carter. He called, his voice clipped, practiced. I wiped my hands on a rag and met him halfway. Who's asking? He extended a card. The embossed letters read James R. Phelps, attorney at law. I represent Ms. Clara Bennett. I have some documents that require your review. The cold air bit at my ears as I took the envelope from him. Thick. Too heavy for anything good. This is regarding the division of property outlined in Mr. Daniel Carter's most recent will. He said, like it was an uncontested fact. We believe a collaborative approach will be best for all parties. I looked up from the envelope. Collaborative. I repeated. Interesting choice of word. He smiled politely, not meeting my eyes. Why would like to avoid unnecessary legal conflict? The smell of horse hay drifted from the barn behind me. I thought of the years Daniel and I spent building every square foot of this place, the calluses on our hands, the nights we slept 4 hours to keep things running. And now, a stranger was standing here with a piece of paper that pretended none of that mattered. I'll have my lawyer review this, I said, my voice steady. You can tell Clara I received it. He nodded, snapped his briefcase shut, and headed back to the car. The engine hummed, tires spitting gravel as he left a trail of dust down the lane. I didn't open the envelope right away. I stood there, watching the dust settle, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The paper inside wasn't just words. It was a line drawn straight across my life, splitting what was ours into hers. Back in the kitchen, I slid the envelope onto the table. The smell of old coffee lingered from the morning. I poured myself a fresh cup, black, no sugar, and sat down. The pages inside were typed clean and cold. Legal jargon wrapped around falsehoods, every paragraph painting Clara's claim as legitimate. And at the end, her signature, bold, deliberate, half the ranch, half the cabins, half of everything. I set the papers down, my hands still. This wasn't just a threat. It was the first move in a game she'd been setting up for years. The language in those documents was calculated. Every clause bent just enough to sound fair, every sentence masking a blade. I flipped the last page over, my thumb pressing into the paper until it left a crease. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control. I called Howard that afternoon. His voice was low, guarded. I've seen a copy, he said. It's not legitimate, Evelyn, but she's moving fast. How fast? I asked. There was a pause, the faint sound of papers shuffling on his end. She's already met with a development group out of Billings. Real estate investors. They've been sniffing around for months. Want to turn part of the pasture into luxury cabins. The words landed like a hoof to the chest. The pasture was the heart of this ranch. Open space where Daniel and I rode every spring, where guests came to feel the wind and see the mountains unobstructed. Cut it up, and the soul of the place would be gone. Do they know she doesn't own it? I said. Doubt it? Howard replied. Or they don't care. She's dangling the idea, getting them interested. I looked out the kitchen window. The late afternoon light was fading, the sky streaked with the first hints of evening. Out beyond the fence, the grass lay flat under the wind. I could almost see surveyor stakes driven into the ground, carving up what was supposed to be ours. She's trying to pressure you, Howard said. Force a settlement before you can push back. The smell of coffee had gone stale in my cup. I set it down, the ceramic clicking against the table. She's not going to win. After we hung up, I pulled the folder of property records from the desk in Daniel's office. The leather of his chair was cold when I sat down. I traced the boundaries of our land with my finger on the map. Every acre we'd paid for, every line we'd defended. My mind replayed Clara's words in the sitting room, for everyone's benefit. Now I understood who, everyone, meant, and it wasn't family. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the porch rail. I closed the file and slid it back into the drawer. This fight wasn't going to be about trading insults in front of a fire. It was going to be about proof, leverage, and patience. I turned off the light in the office. In the dark, I could still see the shape of the envelope on the kitchen table, waiting like a challenge. She thought she'd backed me into a corner. What she didn't know was that I'd already started looking for the way out. and the way through her. By the end of that week, the phone calls had slowed to nothing. I used to get 3-4 messages a day, neighbors asking about boarding a horse, a guest checking in for summer dates, a friend dropping by with fresh eggs. Now, the only rings were spam calls and the occasional wrong number. At the feed store, 2 women I'd known for years suddenly found the birdseed aisle fascinating when I walked in. One of them glanced up, offered a quick, "He?" then turned her back before I could answer. The other kept her head down, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for a bag of grain. It was the same at the co-op. Conversations hushed when I passed. People shifted their carts to block narrow aisles. Smiles felt thin, brittle. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. That maybe everyone was just busy, tired, dealing with their own lives. But by the third day, when even Martha, the postmaster who never missed a chance to swap stories, barely nodded at me, I knew it wasn't coincidence. The cold in the air seemed sharper than it had a right to be. The smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney clung to my coat, heavy and unwanted. Back at the ranch, the quiet felt different now. Not peaceful, but hollow. Like the land itself was holding its breath. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, watching the steam curl. Out past the barn, a hawk circled low, scanning for movement. I knew the feeling. That's when the knock came. 3 short raps, pause, then 2 more. I opened the door to find Tom Riley standing there. Sturdy frame, wind-burned cheeks, and the same denim jacket he'd worn since high school. He'd been one of Daniel's closest friends before moving to Billings to work as a private investigator. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. "Always," I said, stepping aside. He dropped into the chair across from me, eyes scanning the papers still spread across the table. "Heard about Phelps showing up, and about Clara's little sales pitch to the investors." I raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast. In this town. Always has." He leaned back, arms crossed. "I also heard folks are keeping their distance. Don't take it personal. They think staying quiet keeps them safe." Safe. The word sat wrong. Safety meant letting Clara's lie stand, letting her carve up the ranch without a fight. Tom glanced toward the window, watching the hawk glide lower. "I don't like watching a good piece of land get stolen. And I don't like watching Daniel's work get picked apart." I studied him. In this week of closed doors and turned backs, he was the first person to sit across from me without flinching. "You're offering help?" I asked. He gave a half smile. "Let's just say, I know how to find things people want to keep hidden." The hawk outside dropped into a dive. I didn't see where it landed, but I felt the air shift. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone in this fight as Clara wanted me to believe. Tom wrapped his hands around the mug I'd set in front of him, letting the steam curl between his fingers. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice low enough that it felt like the walls were listening. "Clara's been busy." "Busy how?" I asked. "She's telling folks you're overwhelmed, that the ranch is slipping, that maybe it's time for someone with a steadier hand to step in." He gave a dry laugh. Funny, coming from someone who's never shoveled a stall in her life. I stared into my tea, watching the surface tremble as the heater kicked on. The words shouldn't have surprised me, but hearing them out loud made the air feel heavier. "She's planting seeds," Tom went on. "And people here, well, you know how it is. They don't want trouble. They don't want to choose sides." "They already have," I said. Tom met my eyes. "Yeah, silence is a choice." The truth of it settled in my chest like a stone. Every polite smile, every averted glance at the feed store. They weren't accidents. They were quiet endorsements of whatever Clara was selling. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the porch rail. A dusting of snow swirled past the window, catching the dim light. I thought of the pasture in spring, green and open. Now it felt like a chessboard, each move measured, each piece shifting out of reach. "What do you need from me?" Tom asked. The question caught me off guard. I'd spent the last week bracing for the next blow, not planning a counter. Information, I said finally. I need to know exactly what she's telling people, who she's meeting, what she's promising. He nodded. I can do that, and I'll be discreet. Folks talk more when they think no one's paying attention. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight in my shoulders ease. Just a fraction. Why are you doing this, Tom? His gaze flicked to the framed photo on the wall. Daniel, grinning in the saddle, sunlight in his hair. Because he'd do the same for me. And because I don't like seeing good people get steamrolled. For a moment, the kitchen felt warmer. Not from the heater, but from the quiet certainty in his voice. He drained the rest of his coffee, set the mug down, and stood. I'll be in touch, he said. At the door, he hesitated. Just be ready. If she's gearing up for something public, she's going to want it to hurt. After he left, I stayed at the table, the ticking of the clock filling the silence. I could still smell the faint mix of coffee and leather from his jacket. It clung to the air like a reminder. I wasn't entirely alone, but as I looked out at the dark pasture, I knew he was right. Clara wouldn't settle for whispers. She'd want a spectacle. And when it came, I'd have to be ready to face it in front of everyone. The annual Gallatin County Agricultural Board meeting was usually routine. Crop reports, grazing permits, a few heated debates about water rights. I hadn't planned on going this year, but Tom had suggested it. You need to be seen, he'd said. Let folks know you're still in the fight. So I went. The community hall smelled of coffee and sawdust. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage draped in the state flag. I found a seat near the aisle, keeping my hat low as the room filled. Familiar faces drifted past without stopping. A couple of nods, a few polite smiles, nothing more. Then she walked in. Clara wore a tailored navy coat, a silk scarf knotted at her throat, hair swept up like she'd stepped out of a magazine. She paused in the doorway, just long enough for every head to turn. Her son trailed behind, clutching a small toy tractor. The sight of him here felt deliberate. She didn't sit near me. Instead, she chose a chair in the second row, right in the center, where everyone could see her. She greeted people by name, shaking hands, leaning in, as if she belonged to every conversation. The meeting began with the usual formalities. I tried to focus. Irrigation schedules, projected hay yields. But my attention kept drifting to the back of Clara's head, the tilt of her chin. Then, midway through a discussion on property tax assessments, the board opened the floor for community comments. Clara's hand shot up. Madam Chair, she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. I have a concern that I believe affects not just my family, but the entire community. The room quieted. Even the sound of the old radiator seemed to fade. As some of you know, she continued, my late brother-in-law Daniel Carter left behind a substantial property, Carter Ranch. It's been a fixture here for years. She glanced back, catching my eye before turning forward again. But I worry about its future. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. My grip tightened on the pen in my lap. Running such an operation alone is daunting, she said, her tone measured, almost sympathetic. And I fear that without additional oversight, the ranch may not continue to serve the community as it has in the past. My pulse thudded in my ears. Oversight. The word was a snake coiling under the table. A man in the third row nodded slowly, as if she'd voiced a thought he'd been holding. Another leaned toward his neighbor, whispering. Clara pressed on. I believe it's time we consider involving more experienced voices in its management. People who can ensure it remains productive and beneficial to all. She didn't have to say my name. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The chairwoman shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Bennett. The board doesn't. I'm not asking the board to intervene, Clara said, cutting her off with a polite smile. I'm simply urging the community to think about what's at stake. We can't let personal pride stand in the way of what's best for Gallatin County. There it was. Personal pride. reduced to an obstacle, a flaw. I felt the heat rise under my collar. Around me, people avoided my gaze, eyes fixed on the stage or the notes in their laps. Silence can be louder than applause, and in that moment, it roared. The pen in my hand trembled against the paper. I wanted to stand, to speak, to strip her words of their false concern. But I knew, if I moved too soon, I'd be playing into her hands. So I sat still, letting the tension coil tighter. Clara let the pause hang, just long enough for the weight of her words to sink in. Then she reached into her leather tote and pulled out a folder. Slim, neat, the kind meant to suggest order and authority. "I've gathered some information," she said, holding it up so the front row could see. "Nothing confidential. Just public records, financial summaries. I thought it might help everyone understand my concern." A few people leaned forward. The man in the third row who'd nodded earlier adjusted his glasses. I could almost feel the shift in the room. She flipped the folder open, sliding out a few sheets. "For example," she continued, "tax assessments show the ranch's property value has dropped over the last 2 years. Not drastically, but enough to warrant attention. And the number of overnight guests last season was the lowest in a decade." The statements were selective, stripped of context, but they landed. Heads tilted, pens scratched notes. She glanced back at me again, just briefly, her expression carefully neutral. "These aren't criticisms," she said, "merely observations. Indicators that a more structured approach might be beneficial." Beneficial. The word thudded in my chest like a dull hammer. "I know my late brother-in-law loved this land," she added, her voice softening in a way that sounded rehearsed. "And I want to see it thrive for decades to come. But that requires planning. It requires leadership that can adapt." Someone in the back murmured agreement. Another gave a low, The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Ms. Bennett, while the board appreciates community input, management decisions are—" "I understand," Clara interrupted, smiling again. "I'm not here to cause conflict. I'm here because I care. And I think we can all agree, losing the ranch's place in this community would be a tragedy." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was heavy with quiet assent. I sat there, the cheap metal of the folding chair biting into my back, the smell of burnt coffee from the refreshment table turning sour in my nose. My hands itched to grab the folder from her and shred it, to shout about the storms we'd survived, the repairs we'd made, the guests who'd come back year after year. But the truth was, facts didn't matter in this moment. Perception did, and she was shaping it piece by piece. Tom was standing in the back of the room. Our eyes met. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed. A silent warning: not here, not now. I forced my gaze forward, fixing it on the state flag behind the stage. The fabric barely stirred, heavy in the still air. Clara slipped the papers back into her folder, her movements precise, unhurried. "Thank you for your time," she said to the board, then turned slightly toward the audience. "We all want what's best." The chairwoman moved quickly to the next agenda item, but the mood in the room had shifted. Conversations would follow in the parking lot, in kitchens, over coffee. And Clara's version of the story would travel faster than mine. When the meeting adjourned, I stayed seated until most people had left. I could feel the glances, curious, pitying, speculative, as they passed. Clara lingered near the doorway, her son at her side, chatting easily with 2 ranchers who had once been Daniel's friends. I stood, my legs stiff, and walked toward the exit without looking at her. But as I passed, I caught her voice, low and meant for me. "It's only a matter of time, Iv." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because I was saving them. For the moment they would do the most damage. By the time I reached the ranch, the moon was high over the pasture, casting the fences in pale silver. The meeting's aftertaste still clung to me. Clara's measured voice, the polite nods, the folder closing like a coffin lid. I didn't turn on the kitchen lights. My boots tracked faint lines of dust across the floor as I went straight to Daniel's office. The room smelled the same as always. Cedar from the shelves, leather from his chair, a faint trace of the cologne he favored. I hadn't been in here much since the funeral. The desk was neat, the way he'd kept it. But tonight, neat felt like a locked door. I started with the drawers. Stationery, pens, an old invoice for a hay delivery. Nothing useful. My hand hesitated on the bottom drawer, the one that stuck a little. Inside were bank statements, tax receipts, and the metal key I hadn't seen in years. The key to the safe. It was small, warm from my palm as I carried it to the built-in cabinet in the corner. The safe's dial was worn, the numbers faded from years of use. I could still remember Daniel leaning over it, spinning the wheel with easy confidence. The first turn clicked under my hand. The sound was louder than it should have been in the stillness. I entered the combination from memory, each number unlocking a knot in my chest. The final click echoed in the room. Inside, a stack of envelopes sat on top of a leather-bound ledger. The paper smelled faintly of dust and something older. Time, maybe. I pulled out the top envelope. My name was written in Daniel's handwriting, steady and deliberate. For a moment, I just held it. The weight of it was more than paper should carry. I set it aside, forcing myself to stay focused. Beneath it was a folder labeled, Estate. Final. Inside, the first page bore the title Last Will and Testament of Daniel Carter. The date at the top was 3 years old, long before Clara's supposed, most recent, version. I skimmed the opening lines, my eyes catching on the familiar legal phrasing. Then, there it was, the signature. Inked in Daniel's own hand, witnessed, notarized. And the line that left no room for doubt. All property and assets to be transferred solely to Evelyn Carter. No mention of Clara. No mention of a child. I felt my pulse in my fingertips as I set the folder down. The safe still held more. The ledger underneath was heavier than it looked. I opened it to find rows of numbers. Daniel's meticulous record of the ranch's income and expenses. And between the pages, a thin manila envelope marked, Medical. I slid it out, the paper rasping against the leather. The sight of the clinic's logo made my stomach tighten. The date was 5 years ago, the day of the accident that changed everything. I didn't open it. Not yet. I leaned back in Daniel's chair, the leather cool against my shoulders, the weight of the unopened envelope in my hands. Outside, the wind pressed against the windowpane, as if urging me to keep going. But I knew this wasn't just about finding papers. It was about pulling a thread that could unravel everything Clara had built her lie on. And once I started, there would be no putting it back. I turned the envelope over in my hands, the flap sealed tight. My fingers hesitated on the edge, as if opening it would make everything too real to undo. Then I slid a letter opener under the flap. The paper inside was crisp, the medical center's letterhead printed in dark green. My eyes went straight to the line I remembered all too well. Patient sustained pelvic trauma resulting in permanent infertility. Below that, Daniel's name, the date, the attending physician's signature. The words blurred for a moment, my pulse loud in my ears. I set the paper down, pressing my palm over it as if I could shield it from the air. This wasn't just a memory now, it was proof. Proof Clara could never have anticipated. I reached for the envelope with my name on it. Daniel's handwriting was steady, the ink slightly smudged in one corner where his hand must have lingered. I unfolded the single sheet, the faint scent of his cologne rising as the paper opened. Eve. It began. If you're reading this, I'm not here to answer your questions, so I'll do my best to leave you with answers anyway. I've always known you could run this place without me. Probably better than I could, but I also know not everyone will believe that. People like Clara, they find ways to get what they want. Sometimes they use kindness. Sometimes they use bloodlines. Either way, I don't want you to fight blind. The next lines were underlined. The only bloodline that matters here is ours. Yours and mine in the work we've done. The rest is noise. If someone ever claims differently, you'll know where to look for the truth. He'd signed it simply, D. I sat back, the letter trembling in my hands. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the office unnaturally quiet. The safe was still open, its contents like a spine of my life laid bare. Property records, bank ledgers, and now these two pieces that could gut Clara's claim in a heartbeat. The temptation to march straight into town and throw the papers on the table in front of her was strong. I imagined the way her expression would shift, the thin line of her mouth tightening, the flicker in her eyes when she realized the game was over. But Daniel's words stuck. Don't fight blind. This wasn't about a single strike. It was about ending this in a way she couldn't recover from. I refolded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it atop the medical file. Together, they were a shield and a blade. From the desk drawer, I took a legal pad and began making a list. People who'd believe me, people who wouldn't, and the ones on the fence. I added Howard and Tom to the top. Then, in another column, I listed where Clara's lies had already sunk roots. The office clock ticked steadily, each sound sharpening my focus. This wasn't just about proving her wrong. It was about showing everyone else the truth so they'd never doubt again. I locked the safe, slid the key into my pocket, and stood. The weight there felt different now. Not just metal, but possibility. When I stepped out of the office, the hallway light pooled ahead of me, warm against the dark. Somewhere in that glow was the first step of a plan Daniel had started long before I realized I'd need it. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the moonlight slicing across the room in pale blue strips. The house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that soothes. It was the kind that lets every thought echo louder. The safe key was still in my pocket. I could feel its shape against my thigh even under the quilt. Every time I shifted, the metal pressed into me, a reminder of the proof waiting downstairs. I turned onto my side. The scent of cedar from the dresser mingled with the faint trace of Daniel's cologne that still clung to the pillow beside me. It brought back the image of him in the barn, brushing down a horse, humming under his breath. That memory tightened my throat. Part of me wanted to drive into town, right then, find Clara, and watch her face crumble as I dropped the medical file and Daniel's letter in front of her. Let her choke on the lies she'd been feeding the community. But another part, the part Daniel would listen to, knew better. He'd written those words for a reason. Don't fight blind. This wasn't just about winning. It was about ending it so thoroughly that she couldn't twist it into something else. The wind rattled the window pane. I glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. My mind kept replaying the scene at the meeting hall, the way people leaned toward Clara's voice, the way their eyes slid past me. That hurt in a way I wasn't ready to name. I kicked off the covers and swung my legs to the floor. The boards were cold under my feet as I padded to the kitchen. I didn't turn on the overhead light, just the small lamp by the stove. It cast a warm circle on the counter, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. The coffee pot was still half full from earlier. I poured a cup, the smell bitter and grounding. Outside, the pasture stretched into darkness, the barn a darker shape against the horizon. I thought of the list I'd started in Daniel's office. The allies, the doubters, the undecideds. It wasn't enough to have proof. I needed to make sure that when I used it, it landed in front of the right eyes in the right setting. That meant patience. Timing. I took a sip of coffee, the heat burning my tongue. In the stillness, the plan began to take shape. Not fully formed, but enough to push back the urge to act on impulse. Upstairs, the bedroom felt less like a refuge now. It felt like a place to think, to wait, to sharpen the edge I would eventually swing. By the time the first light crept over the mountains, I was still awake. But the restlessness had shifted into something else. Something colder, steadier. Clara thought she'd set the pace. She was wrong. From now on, every move would be mine to decide. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the first pale light was starting to edge the horizon. I sat at the kitchen table, legal pad in front of me, pen tapping against the paper in a steady rhythm. Column after column filled with notes, names, places, questions. Who could be swayed? Who was already lost to Clara's side? Who might be waiting to see which way the wind blew before choosing? I wrote, Tom, at the top of the allies list, then, Howard, beneath it. Both could keep things quiet until the moment came. After that, I left 2 blank lines, space for the people I'd need to win over. I flipped to a fresh page and sketched out scenarios. If I went public now, Clara would paint me as desperate. If I waited too long, she'd try to close the sale on the pasture before I could stop her. The sweet spot was narrow, but it existed. A flicker of memory interrupted me. Daniel standing in the coral one fall afternoon, sleeves rolled up, watching a storm roll in over the mountains. You don't run from it, he'd said. You figure where it's going to break, and you stand there ready. Back then, he'd been talking about weather. Now, the storm was Clara. I sipped the last of the coffee, cold now, bitter on my tongue. My mind turned to her visits over the years. The way she'd slip into the kitchen while Daniel worked outside, the questions about bills and contracts, the sudden interest in guest numbers. At the time, they'd felt intrusive. Now, they looked like reconnaissance. The realization tightened my jaw. She'd been playing a long game. But she wasn't the only one who could think past the next move. I got up and crossed to the window. The barn sat still in the dim light, doors closed, the pasture stretching out behind it. From here, it looked untouched, whole. And that's how it needed to stay. Back at the table, I stacked Daniel's letter and the medical file in a plain manila folder. I didn't want them in the safe tonight. I wanted them close, where I could see them, feel their weight. They weren't just documents now, they were the spine of my plan. I made another list, this one titled, Clara's Moves. Public humiliation, check. Legal pressure, check. Whisper campaign, check. The pattern was clear, soft in the ground. Then move in. If she thought I'd stay reactive, she was in for a surprise. The sky outside shifted from gray to pale gold. Another day was starting, whether I was ready or not. But I was ready. More than I'd been since the night she walked into that dinner with her envelope and her smile. I closed the folder and slid it into my bag. From now until this ended, it would stay within arm's reach. Daniel had trusted me to guard what we built. Now it was my turn to finish what he'd started. Clara could keep circling. I was done running. The next time we met, it would be on ground I'd chosen, with the storm breaking exactly where I wanted it. By mid-morning, the frost on the fence rails had melted into thin rivulets, sliding down the wood like quiet clocks marking the hours. I stood on the porch with the phone in my hand, the manila folder beside me. This wasn't going back into a safe, it was going into motion. Tom picked up on the second ring. Morning, he said, voice steady. I'm ready to start, I told him. He didn't need me to explain what start meant. I'll ask around. Quietly. There's a guy at the feed store who knows which investors Clara's been talking to. And I've got a contact at the county clerk's office who can flag any property filings. Good, I said. And Tom. Only people we trust. No one else hears about the medical file or Daniel's letter. Understood. After we hung up, I carried the folder back into the kitchen and spread its contents across the table. The pages looked plain, almost harmless, but I knew what they could do. Before they saw the light of day, I wanted every angle covered. I went to Daniel's office and pulled out the old lockbox we'd used for business receipts. Inside were years of ledgers, guest logs, tax records. I flipped through each, noting the patterns, the dips and spikes. Nothing here could hurt me, but I wanted to be sure there were no gaps Clara could twist into evidence of mismanagement. By noon, I had a separate stack, clean copies of documents that proved the ranch was stable, more than stable. Guest reservations, maintenance logs, the recent appraisal showing the pasture's value holding steady. Howard would need these. I called him next. I'll review them, he said, his tone sharpening when I mentioned the appraisal. She's been claiming depreciation. This undercuts that entirely. That's the point, I told him. I want the truth lined up before I make a move. Howard hesitated. She's not going to stop pushing, Evelyn. I know, I said. That's why I'm done just holding the line. When the calls were finished, I sat with my coffee and looked at the lists from last night. Names in 3 columns. Allies, doubters, unknowns. The unknowns were my focus now. If I could shift even a few of them before Clara's next play, her footing would slip. I thought about how she'd work more whispers, another public concern, maybe even a staged offer from the investors to make me look unreasonable if I refused. Each scenario was a door, and I meant to lock every one before she reached it. The rest of the afternoon, I drove into town under the guise of running errands. At the hardware store, I lingered near 2 ranchers talking about an upcoming county fair. At the cafe, I paid for a coffee and sat where I could see who Clara spoke to when she came in. She didn't appear, but I caught sight of her car parked outside the bank. Another thread to pull. Back at the ranch, the light was going gold, stretching shadows across the pasture. I carried the folder upstairs, set it on the nightstand. I wanted it close enough to reach for in the dark. This wasn't about waiting anymore. Every small action, every conversation, every document copied, was a step forward. She might think I was boxed in, but in truth, I was drawing the box around her. And when it was finished, there would be only one way out, and it wouldn't be hers to take. 2 days later, Tom showed up at the ranch, just as the sun was sinking behind the bridgers. The sky was streaked in orange and violet, the kind of light Daniel used to stop and admire no matter how busy he was. Tom stepped inside, stamping the dust off his boots. "Got something for you," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "Times, dates, and names. Clara's been busier than you think." I spread it out on the kitchen table. 3 meetings at the Mountain View Cafe. 1 lunch at the Riverside Grill with 2 men from Billings. And a note about her stopping by the office of Greg Foster, local real estate broker with a reputation for working fast and quiet. "She's laying the groundwork," I said, tracing the dates with my finger. The pattern was clear, every meeting within a 10-day span. Too much for coincidence. Tom poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the counter. "Foster's the kind who doesn't ask questions if the check clears. If she gets him involved, she can move a sale along before most people even know it's happening." I leaned back in my chair. "Then we make sure the right people know, at the right time." We went over the details, cross-referencing them with the investor names Howard had passed along. 2 overlapped. That was enough to prove a connection if I needed to. "Anything else?" I asked. Tom hesitated. "Yeah, one of the waitresses at Mountain View heard Clara talking about fixing the narrative before the summer season. Sounds like she wants to paint you as unstable, overwhelmed. Make the investors think you'll fold." I felt my jaw tighten. "Then we give them another story." That night, after Tom left, I locked the kitchen door and carried my folder upstairs. I laid everything out on the bed: Daniel's letter, the medical file, the will, the appraisal, the guest logs. Beside them, Tom's list of meetings and names. I started pairing documents, proof against every angle she might take. If she claimed the ranch was losing value, I had the appraisal. If she played the family card, I had the medical file. If she hinted at legal standing, I had the will. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the dresser. I could feel the shape of the plan forming, no longer just ideas on a notepad. This was the foundation. I made 2 copies of each key document, sliding them into separate envelopes. One would go to Howard for safekeeping. The other I'd keep on me, no matter where I went. The originals stayed in the plain folder on my nightstand. Before turning in, I called Howard. "When I bring you the copies, I want to talk strategy. Not defense. Offense." He paused on the line. "Understood. Sounds like you're ready." "I am," I said. The next morning, I stood on the porch watching the pasture in the early light. Frost still clung to the grass, but the sun was rising fast, burning it off. The day felt sharper, like the moment just before a horse bolts. Tension coiled, waiting. Clara had made her moves in the open, confident no one could match her pace. She didn't see what was coming, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The storm was building. And this time, I'd be the one deciding where it broke. It was Howard's idea to call the meeting at the ranch. Not formal, just family and a few close friends, to talk about the future of the place. The invitation went out with coffee and pie as the bait. Around here, people show up for those. By late afternoon, the long table in the dining room was full. A pot of coffee steamed at one end, plates of pie lined up at the other. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the air, wrapping the tension in something deceptively warm. Clara arrived 10 minutes late. She breezed in wearing a cream-colored sweater and boots polished enough to catch the light. Her son trailed behind, clutching a tablet. She smiled at the group like she'd just done them all a favor by showing up. Howard stood at the head of the table. "Thanks for coming. Evelyn wanted to speak with you all about some concerns that have been floating around." I could feel every eye shift toward me. My pulse thudded, but I kept my face calm. "Some of you have heard," I began, "that the ranch is in trouble. That I can't keep it running. That maybe it's time for additional oversight." A few people shifted in their chairs. Clara's lips curved in a small, private smile. I've stayed quiet while those ideas made their way around town. I continued, because I thought the truth would speak for itself. But it's clear now. Silence just lets the lies grow. Howard stepped aside as I set a folder on the table. Not the manila one from my nightstand. The slimmer, curated version. "This," I said, opening it, "is the most recent property appraisal. Completed 6 months ago by an independent assessor. The ranch's value is steady and the pasture is in excellent condition." I slid copies down the table. Pages rustled. One of Daniel's old friends, seated near the middle, nodded slowly as he scanned the numbers. "And here," I went on, pulling out the next sheet, "are the guest logs for the past 2 years. Last summer was slower. That's true. But bookings for this season are already higher than the 5-year average." Clara tilted her head. "Paperwork is easy to produce, Evelyn, but numbers don't change the fact that managing all of this alone is." Exactly what Daniel and I planned for. I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. "We built this place to last, with or without him." A murmur moved through the room. Howard cleared his throat. "Let's keep this orderly." I pulled one last document from the folder. "This is Daniel's will, dated 3 years ago, signed, witnessed, and notarized. It leaves all property to me. No amendments. No conditions." Clara's smile tightened. "I have a more recent version." I met her eyes. "We'll get to that." Around the table, people exchanged glances. The certainty in her voice was still there, but it didn't land as cleanly as before. Seeds of doubt had been planted. I closed the folder deliberately. I'm not here to convince anyone who's already made up their mind. I'm here so those of you caught in the middle can see there's more to this story than what you've been told. Clara leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Stories are easy to spin." "Less," I said. "They are. Which is why I prefer facts." The air felt heavier now, the kind of weight that settles right before a storm breaks. I could see the calculation in her eyes. She knew I hadn't played my full hand yet, and that knowledge unsettled her. Howard stepped in again, steering the conversation toward property maintenance and future plans. People listened, but their attention kept drifting back to me, to Clara, to the quiet gap between us that was filling fast with questions. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth steady me. The real proof, the kind that would end this, was still locked away at the ranch. And when I brought it out, it wouldn't just clear my name. It would burn the ground Clara had been standing on. Clara broke the silence first. "You can wave around whatever documents you want," she said lightly, though her fingers were gripping the edge of her chair. "But we all know Daniel's intentions evolved. He wanted to provide for his son. The word son slid into the room like a challenge. A couple of people shifted. Uncomfortable. I saw one of the ranch hands glance toward me, then back at her. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Clara, there's something you've left out of your story. She arched an eyebrow. Oh. Howard gave a small nod, his way of telling me to proceed. I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain envelope, setting it between us. The sound of the paper hitting wood was louder than it should have been. This is from Bozeman Regional Medical Center, I said. 5 years ago, Daniel was injured in an accident on a fire call. The injury was serious enough that it changed our lives in ways we kept private. Clara's smile faltered. What does that have to do with? I slid the document across to her. It states, in no uncertain terms, that Daniel could not have fathered a child after that date. The room went still. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to hold its breath. Clara didn't reach for the paper. Her eyes darted to the people around the table, gauging their reactions. A murmur started at one end, moving like a ripple through the room. One of Daniel's oldest friends cleared his throat. Is that legitimate? Howard answered for me. I've reviewed it. It's signed by the attending physician and verified by the hospital. I let the weight of that settle before I pulled out the second envelope. And this is a letter Daniel wrote to me. It's not long, but it's clear. I unfolded it carefully, the paper soft from being handled. My voice was steady as I read Eve. If someone ever tries to use my name or my bloodline to take what we built, you'll know where to look for the truth. The only family this ranch needs is you and the work we've done together. When I looked up, Clara was staring at the table. Her hands were clasped in her lap now, knuckles pale. I don't know what kind of story you've been telling people, I said, but it stops here. The murmurs grew louder, a mix of shock and indignation. A woman who'd been sitting near Clara shifted her chair away. 2 of the men from the board exchanged glances that weren't in her favor. Clara finally spoke, her voice low but sharp. You think this changes anything? People believe what they want to believe. Maybe, I said, leaning back. But now they've seen proof, and proof doesn't fade as fast as gossip. Howard gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder. I think we've covered enough for today, he said, his tone final. As people stood, the energy in the room had shifted. Those who had avoided my eyes earlier now met them, some with small nods, others with murmured words of support. No one moved to speak with Clara. She remained seated until most of the room had emptied, then rose slowly. Her son tugged at her sleeve, but she didn't look at him. She looked at me. This isn't over, she said. It is for you, I replied. She left without another word, her boots clicking down the hallway and out the front door. The sound faded, but the release in the room was immediate, like a window had been opened after a long, stale winter. Howard handed me the folder. Keep it close, he said quietly. We've turned the tide, but there's still fallout. I nodded, feeling the adrenaline ebb, replaced by something steadier. Clara might try to spin, to salvage her version, but the foundation was gone. She'd been cornered in front of the very people she'd been trying to win. And now, for the first time in weeks, I felt the ground under my feet was mine again. The next morning, the phone started ringing again. Not all at once, not in a flood, but enough to notice. Howard called first, short, to the point, letting me know the board members who'd been at the meeting were reviewing the matter internally. Translation: they were backing away from Clara. An hour later, Martha from the post office left me a voicemail. Heard you held your ground, Evelyn. Proud of you. Her voice carried that mix of warmth and small-town approval I hadn't heard in weeks. When I drove into town for feed, the air felt different. People didn't exactly rush over to shake my hand, but they didn't duck behind shelves anymore either. At the register, the clerk looked me in the eye and asked about the ranch, genuinely this time. It was small, but it mattered. Even at the cafe, where Clara had held court more than once. The usual cluster by the front window greeted me with nods. One of the ranchers even pulled out the chair next to him, inviting me to sit. I didn't, but the gesture stuck. Clara, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. Tom had heard she'd canceled a lunch with one of the Billings investors. Howard mentioned she'd called him once, terse, asking about next steps. He told her everything would go through me from now on. I could imagine how that landed. Back at the ranch, the quiet felt lighter. The barn doors creaked in the wind, the horses shifting in their stalls, tails flicking lazily. I mucked out the stalls myself that afternoon, the rhythm of the work steadying me. The smell of hay and leather filled the air, grounding me in the things that hadn't changed. That night, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea. The sky was a wash of stars, the kind you only get when the air's cold enough to bite. I thought about Daniel, about the way he'd take moments like this, leaning back, breathing deep, letting the world settle around him. The fight wasn't completely over. I knew that. People like Clara don't fold without looking for a crack to slip back through. But the edges had shifted in my favor, and everyone could feel it. I took a sip of tea, the steam curling up into the dark. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't bracing for the next blow. I was just here. On my land. In my home. And that was enough for tonight. Over the next week, Clara's absence became its own kind of presence. She didn't show up at the cafe on Thursday morning, where she'd once held her impromptu meetings. Her usual chair by the window sat empty, sunlight spilling across the table as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming. At the feed store, her name stopped coming up in conversation altogether, replaced by talk of weather patterns and the spring calving season. Tom told me she'd backed out of a planned appearance at the county charity auction. Said something about needing to focus on family. He said with a shrug. Around here, that phrase could mean anything from a vacation to a retreat in defeat. I didn't press for details. I didn't need them. The shift was visible in the way people moved. Less whispering, more open glances when I walked into a room. At church on Sunday, Martha waved me over to her pew, patting the seat beside her. It was the first time in months I'd felt that invitation without an undercurrent of pity. Back at the ranch, I poured my energy into the work that had always grounded me. Repairs on the south fence, prepping the guest cabins for the early bookings, walking the pasture at sunrise with the frost still on the grass. The horses followed me along the fence line, their breath clouding in the morning air. Howard stopped by one afternoon with a stack of finalized paperwork. "Everything's in order," he said, handing me the folder. The title, the will, the appraisal, all officially filed and uncontested now. I took it, the weight of it solid in my hands. "Thank you," I said. It didn't feel like enough, but he understood. That evening, I called a few people who'd quietly stood by me through the worst of it. Invited them out for coffee, or to stop by the ranch when they had time. It wasn't about making speeches or setting the record straight anymore. It was about rebuilding the threads that had frayed. In town, the greetings grew warmer, more certain. People lingered a little longer in conversation. A couple of younger ranchers even asked my opinion on pasture rotation, something I hadn't been asked in years. Small signs, but they added up. And still, I kept the manila folder close. Not because I thought Clara would try again so soon, but because I'd learned something in all this. You guard what matters, and you don't assume peace will keep itself. One evening, as the sun slid low over the mountains, I sat on the porch with the folder beside me. The land stretched wide and golden in the fading light. Every fence post and cabin a piece of work Daniel and I had put in with our own hands. For the first time since the funeral, the view didn't carry the shadow of what might be taken. It felt whole. I knew there would always be storms on the horizon. That was the nature of this place, and of people. But I also knew I could meet them head-on, just as I had this one. The calm had returned. Not the naive calm of before, but the kind that comes when you've weathered the wind and are still standing. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the snow had pulled back to the far edges of the pasture, leaving the ground soft underfoot. Shoots of green threaded through the brown, and the air carried that mix of damp earth and new beginnings. I walked the fence line one morning, the sun just clearing the ridge. The horses followed at a lazy distance, their coats glossy from winter feed. Beyond them, the mountains stood clear and sharp against a sky rinsed clean of clouds. It was the kind of day that made you believe in starting over. The ranch was quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. No whispers, no folded arms at meetings. No strangers pulling into the drive with envelopes in hand. Just the steady rhythm of work. Repairing gates, checking the water lines, prepping the cabins for the first guests of the season. Howard's paperwork sat in the desk in Daniel's office now, neatly filed. The will, the appraisal, the medical record, all in their proper place, their authority no longer questioned. I still kept copies in the manila folder on my nightstand. Old habits don't fade quickly, and some safeguards are worth keeping. Clara hadn't been back. Word was she'd moved to stay with a cousin in Helena. For a change of scenery. Whether she'd return someday, I couldn't say. But if she did, it would be to a place that no longer had room for her schemes. The community had shifted too. People stopped me in town to ask about the horses, or to trade planting tips. At the cafe, my coffee arrived without me having to order, the way it used to. The air between me and my neighbors no longer carried that wary distance. We'd found our way back to something like trust. One Saturday, Tom came by to help mend the south fence. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the metallic ring of nails and the creak of wood filling the spaces where words weren't needed. When we were done, he leaned on the post and looked out over the pasture. "You've done right by this place," he said. I thought of Daniel, of all the mornings we'd stood just like this, planning out the day ahead. "We both did," I said quietly. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the last light bleed out of the sky. The air smelled faintly of lilac from the bush by the steps, its buds just starting to open. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The sound was low and steady, like a reminder that life keeps its own rhythm, no matter what storms pass through. I thought back to the night Clara had walked into that memorial dinner with her envelope and her smile. How quickly the ground beneath me had shifted. How much I'd had to learn about patience, about choosing the right moment to move. About the kind of strength that doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from standing the longest. The ranch would go on, not because of a piece of paper, but because of the work and care woven into every acre. That was Daniel's legacy. Now it was mine too. In the morning, there would be chores. There always were. Guests arriving by the weekend, repairs to finish, seed to plant. The cycle would continue, just as it had before, but I'd meet it with something new. The certainty that I could protect what mattered. The moon rose over the ridge, washing the pasture in silver. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs. Healing, I realized, wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about knowing it no longer had the power to unmake you. I set my mug down and rested my hands on the porch rail, feeling the grain of the wood under my palms. Somewhere in the quiet, I could almost hear Daniel's voice, steady and sure. "You've got this, Iv." And I believed it. So, if you've ever had to stand your ground, if you've fought for something that was yours in the face of doubt and whispers, tell me, what would you have done in my place? Share your story. You might be surprised who needs to hear it. Looking back, I understand now that this fight was never just about land or paperwork. It was about dignity, about the right to stand in your own life without bowing to someone else's control or whispers. I learned that silence has value, but only when it's used to watch, prepare, and choose the exact moment to strike. And when you hold the truth in your hands, you don't need to shout to be heard. You only need to let it see the light. The greatest lesson Legacy isn't only what you leave behind when you're gone. Legacy is what you protect every single day, through determination, through steadiness, and by never letting others define your worth. If someone ever tries to rewrite your story, remember this: you are the one holding the pen. Grip it tight, and keep writing, in a way that you'll be proud of when you look back.